in Ethiopia. Of the 6 million people that live in Tigray, we estimate that 3.5 to 4.5 million are in need of urgent humanitarian food assistance. Of these, 700,000 to 900,000 people are already experiencing catastrophic conditions. Populations at that level of food insecurity are facing extreme deprivation, starvation, destitution, and death. Nearly 40 years ago, Ethiopia endured a famine that shocked the world, devastated the country, and killed an estimated 1 million people. Without a sustained cessation of hostilities, improved humanitarian access, and a scale-up of assistance, we will likely once again see widespread famine in Ethiopia this year. Several weeks ago, testifying before the Senate, I shared the stories of Mariam and Haben. Today, I want to tell you about Johannes. Johannes is a 23-year-old whose family was split up when they fled conflict in Tigray. His friends were shot and killed as they fled, but he couldn't stop to help them, or he risked being killed himself. He reached Sudan with his father, but then returned to Tigray to find his 11-year-old sister and 5-year-old brother. The three of them now live in an informal settlement in Ethiopia, separated from their parents and reliant on the local community for food. Sadly, there are 200 million stories of displacement like Johannes's in Tigray and across the border in Sudan, where 45,000 refugees have fled. The scale of need in Tigray is immense, and averting widespread famine requires more than just food assistance. There are also devastating reports of widespread human rights abuses, including gender-based violence by armed actors across Tigray. The reports speak to widespread incidents of rape and other gender-based violence, and systematic attempts to dismantle society and destroy families. Perpetrators have targeted the wives of priests, abused women in front of their families, and used brutal violence against women. As I've said publicly before, the severity of abuse is among the absolute worst I have seen in my nearly 2 decades of humanitarian work. We at USAID condemn these atrocities in the strongest possible terms. In the face of staggering need, the United States has responded with significant support and advocacy. We're the largest donor to the humanitarian response, providing nearly $488 million in humanitarian assistance since the conflict began. More than 3.9 million people with assistance. And the USAID funding announced earlier this month will provide enough additional food to feed 3 million people for nearly 2 months. It also provides support for case management for survivors of gender-based violence, safe spaces, psychosocial support services for women and girls, and training for social workers and community caseworkers. We've also been loudly ringing the alarm about the deteriorating situation in Tigray. We've held a series of high-level events earlier this month focused on Tigray, convening humanitarian partners, diplomats, donor counterparts, and even the weekend for urgent discussions on famine and ongoing atrocities. This is part of an ongoing effort to drive action on Tigray among donors and the broader public and continue to increase pressure on parties to the conflict to bring an end to this crisis. Our assistance, though, is not enough to avert widespread famine in Ethiopia if the parties to the conflict obstruct access to people in need. Currently, more than 1 million people are in need and inaccessible to humanitarians. The response has been hindered from the beginning by access constraints imposed by the government of Ethiopia and blocking of assistance by the Eritrean Defense Forces, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, and the Amharic Special Forces. The unilateral ceasefire yesterday by the government of Ethiopia is very welcome, and we hope to build on that momentum. To be clear, the threat of widespread famine is man-made. If actors on the ground block assistance and prevent farmers from planting and harvesting, these actors are actively increasing the likelihood of widespread famine. I'm honored to be here today to discuss our work and underscore our commitment to the people of Ethiopia. Our humanitarian assistance can help alleviate urgent need, but it will not address the root causes of the conflict or ongoing human rights violations. Despite the heroic efforts of local communities and humanitarian workers, the trajectory of the crisis in Tigray is troubling. Widespread famine, unless parties to the conflict sustain a cessation of hostilities and provide unhindered humanitarian access. We must ensure that they do. We owe it to children like 13-year-old Rachel, a pseudonym. She had been an active student that enjoyed poetry and sports before she was forced to flee with her sister and great uncle when conflict broke out in Western Tigray. Part of another family torn apart by the violence, she now lives in an informal settlement with limited access to food, where she's become withdrawn and anxious and misses her mother. For Johannes, for Rahel, for their families, for their neighbors, we must demand better. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, both of you. And I'm now going to recognize members for 5 minutes each pursuant to House rules, and all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. I'm going to recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let us know, and our staff will come back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphones and address the chair verbally and identify yourself so that we know who is speaking. I'll ask the witnesses to try to be brief because we want to work within the 5-minute time limitation in response, and ask the members to make sure that they give time for the witness to answer questions should they choose to ask a question. So I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Ambassador Godek, I noted at the top of my remarks the situation in Tigray, and I'm just looking at some text, but actually some recently put out texting, as well as emails that are going back and forth now in regards to the ceasefire and whether or not it's real or not. And we hear that the TLP may be looking to go into Eritrean territories, if required or if necessary, is what they said from what I understand. So my question to you, do you think that this ceasefire is, and what can we do to try to make sure there's a real opening to negotiate? Or, or the sides just trying to look at this as the next phase of a protracted conflict of morphing into a civil war? Have any thoughts on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The ceasefire announcement by the Ethiopian government was an important development, but it needs to be made real on the ground. What we need is a permanent ceasefire, which all of the parties are committed to. The moment we still do not have a statement from the TPLF or the Eritreans that they're committed to a ceasefire, and we urge that that happen. We need a ceasefire that will allow humanitarian access and other issues to be addressed. The administration is going to work very hard to help put this in place. We are in contact with the government. We're in contact with other parties, and we will be pressing them very hard to reach an understanding and put in place a permanent ceasefire, and then begin an inclusive national dialogue that addresses all of the issues, to include the issues in Tigray. That's essential if Ethiopia is going to make progress.
So, and I go back and forth because, as I said, I see fault, and I think you've indicated on your statement, and Ms. Charles on hers, that all sides have done wrong in this. So we're not looking to say it's one side as opposed to the other. It's all sides that have. Recently, we've also asked Eritrean and Ethiopian officials, they failed to follow through on their commitments to withdraw Eritrean troops from Ethiopia. In fact, there's been some reporting that there's fresh Ethiopian troop rotations into Tigray, and Eritrean troop rotations into Tigray, and Eritrean troops are fanning out to other parts of Ethiopia as recently as earlier this month. So I was wondering if you could give us the status of the Eritrean Defense Forces in Ethiopia and how they are commanded and controlled.
I'm sorry, the Eritrean Defense Forces?
Eritrean.
Defense Forces, yes. The Eritrean Defense Forces are still in Tigray. We have seen some indications of movement, but we don't yet know that they are withdrawing. They have committed horrifying atrocities during their time there. That much is clear. We do know that they were present as well in the Al-Fashaga border area. We've seen reports, but I can't confirm them, that they were present in other parts of the country as well. The Eritrean forces need to leave immediately. That is absolutely essential if there's going to be peace and a restoration of civil order and stability in Tigray and indeed in more generally in Ethiopia. The Eritrean forces have been a malign force in this conflict and have
So,
undermined.
what's your assessment, and I know, on whether or not what's taking place is crimes against humanity or a genocide occurring in Tigray? And I know we had Secretary Blinken testify before here. Do we know when we can expect a determination by the State Department on its findings?
So, Mr. Chairman, the administration is in full agreement that horrifying atrocities have been committed in Tigray. And Secretary Blinken did say in earlier testimony, as you said, that there were acts of ethnic cleansing. We are in the process of a fact and law-based review to determine whether the terms crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes can and should be used. That assessment is quite far advanced. The final decision on whether we're going to use those terms is up to the Secretary of State.
Thank you. My time has expired. I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think the timing of this hearing can be more appropriate with the ceasefire called just yesterday. For them to know that the eyes of Congress are watching and the American people are watching this, and it needs to stop. And I hope in that way, Mr. Chairman, that this committee can make a difference in this Congress by holding this very hearing for them to know that we are watching this. Will hopefully prevail with the ceasefire that will take hold. But I wanted to ask a little differently the same question the chairman asked, Ambassador. You know, the 1948 Genocide Convention legally obligates states to prevent and to punish crimes of genocide. The EU's special envoy to the Horn of Africa and the Finnish foreign minister said that senior Ethiopian officials told him, quote, they're going to wipe out the Tigrayans for 100 years. Earlier this month, Administrator Power said that Ethiopia is, quote, destroying the reproductive health of Tigrayans, which calls into question whether conditions amount to a genocide. And then Secretary Blinken called this ethnic cleansing. Now, I know you can't answer this directly, and I'm at this issue, but in my judgment, when I look at the Genocide Convention and the requirements for it to be called a genocide, I think those requirements have been met. Do you have any response?
Thank you, Representative McCall. I would simply say first that we do look forward to working with the committee and the Congress, as you indicated, and that this hearing is indeed well timed. With respect to your specific point, as I indicated earlier, we have this fact and law-based review underway. We have pushed it at a very accelerated pace, and it is far advanced. Secretary needs to make a decision, and when he's ready, that I'm sure will happen.
Yeah, well, thank you for that candid answer. Ms. Charles, I mean, you said 1 million people now are experiencing catastrophic food insecurity, millions more on the brink. And I guess the question is getting our humanitarian assistance in. There's been discussions about, securing the border so to block out any humanitarian assistance and NGOs from getting into the affected population. Can you tell us what the latest is and what are the plans on USAID's part to ensure that this assistance is provided?
Thank you for that question. And I also want to say the clear, united voice of Congress in raising the alarm bell around famine and the need for humanitarian access has been really important and consequential. As you said, nearly 800,000 people currently at catastrophic levels, possibly up to 2 million more at emergency levels of food insecurity. We've significantly scaled up our assistance since March and are working with partners not just on food assistance, but all the health and nutrition, the enablers that are necessary to prevent famine. But the next week and 2 weeks will really be quite consequential if this unilateral ceasefire holds and we're able to take advantage of this. We've pre-positioned food, but we need a couple of things to happen almost immediately. We need the government to lift the communications, which is still ongoing as of this morning, in order to enable our partners to get out. We need the Amharic regional forces to lift checkpoints on the 3 major arteries that we will need to move food on over the next several weeks. And we need to continue to press on our UN and our other donor partners to continue to scale up assistance as well.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sharon. I hope this hearing will provide some assistance to meeting the goals that you stated. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The ranking member yields back. I now recognize Representative Brad Sherman of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the hearings on this catastrophe. It deserves congressional attention. We are the largest aid donor to Ethiopia, providing roughly $650 million per year, including military aid.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask that the gentleman speak up?
Yeah, get a little closer to your mic, Mr. Sherman.
I'm pretty close, as you can see on the screen, but I do have a big mouth, so I'll put it to good use. Mr. Chairman, once again, thank you for holding these hearings. We are the largest aid donor to Ethiopia, some $650 million a year, including military aid. And we should obviously expect better from a government that is receiving that level of aid. Ms. Charles, are the Tigrayan forces and is the Ethiopian government opine on whether those two parties are cooperating in the delivery of aid to the people of Tigray?
Thank you for that question. And I just want to be clear, our assistance at this point is only for the Ethiopian people and not working through the government of Ethiopia. We very much welcome the news of the unilateral ceasefire from the government of Ethiopia and hope that they take steps in the next several days, not least of which lifting that communications blackout, extending visas for
Ms.
humanitarian.
Charles, my focus is on what prior to today
Okay.
has the Tigrayan forces obstructed or cooperated with aid delivery, as the Ethiopian government obstructed or cooperated with aid delivery.
We've seen violations on all sides, but there's no question that the EDF, the Eritrean Defense Forces, the Amharic regional forces, and to some extent the ENDF have been the biggest barriers to aid, more so than the Tigrayan forces. We also had bureaucratic obstruction from the government of Ethiopia, including restrictions on communications equipment, visas, and other enablers to the response.
Well, we see, as the ranking member points out, 1 million people facing grave food insecurity, 2 million people displaced, 100,000 forced out of their country and into adjoining countries. Given the mountain humanitarian crisis, organizations like OMNA Tigray are calling for unrestricted aid. And I would hope that all sides would allow aid to get through to those who need it. Mr. Gadek, we know that the government in Addis Ababa is trying to destroy what it regards as its rivals, both political and perhaps ethnic. Eritrea has sent in its troops, and first both the Addis government and Eritrea denied it. Now they've announced that the troops are being withdrawn. I don't exactly believe that. What is Eritrea being given by the government of Addis Ababa to do its dirty work and to commit these barbaric acts against those the government regards as its opponents?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. The government in Eritrea and President Isaias have long held significant animus toward the TPLF as a result of earlier conflicts, disagreements, and issues. And it's clear that I think the government of Eritrea is seeking or was seeking the destruction of the TPLF. So I think that the government of Eritrea
So they're doing it for their own purposes, not in return for territorial concessions.
So
grievances.
they're doing it for their own purposes, but I was going to add, Congressman, there is also a territorial issue, and I would expect that the Eritreans probably were hoping for some small territorial compensation along the border between the two countries.
So government in Addis oppresses its own people, brings in a foreign and hostile power to kill them as well, and then maybe transferring territory to fire. It's my understanding that that it's just a one or short-term ceasefire announced by one side that lost a major battle and feels they need to regroup. Is there any evidence that this is that what's being proposed is an armistice and peace?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. From temporary ceasefire that was announced by the Ethiopian government. What's critical now is that it become a permanent, negotiated, agreed ceasefire that all the parties are committed to. There's no guarantee that's going to happen. The administration is going to work to make it happen, and we certainly welcome congressional efforts to engage on this issue as well.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey,
Thank
who's
you,
the
sir.
ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa.
And again, thank you to our two distinguished witnesses for your work and for your testimony. Mr. Ambassador, you point out that 700,000 to 900,000 people are experiencing catastrophic phase 5 food insecurity. You point out that it's entirely man-made. And you go on to say how the Eritrean and Ethiopian forces have purposely and methodically destroyed water points, health facilities, schools, food storage sites, ag and livestock inputs, and farming equipment, which is eerily reminiscent of Mengistu, using food as a weapon in order to destroy individuals, whole families, whole populations. So I just thank you for underscoring that, because it is totally preventable. And I'm glad you're taking so many efforts and the administration to do that. If you could speak to the issue of full and hopefully unhindered humanitarian access, and Ms. Charles, you might want to do this as well. You did point out 13 humanitarian workers have been killed, including 3 from Doctors Without Borders. I wonder if you could, Mr. Ambassador, briefly talk about the role of the church. I've been to Ethiopia many times, and the church community, whether it be Muslim or Christian, I've met with the patriarch many times, they all really have they been sidelined. The issue of Genocide Watch has said that they put out a genocidal massacre warning that of ethnic Amharas by the Oromo Liberation Army. In addition to everything we're talking about with Tigray, obviously there's other festering problems occurring. And then if you could speak briefly about the desert locust infestations. We have a bill that's out of committee waiting for floor action that would really try to do much more as that crisis emerges and reemerges, as it has been doing for so many months and years. Yield.
Thank you, Congressman, for the questions. On the religious leaders have been engaged in this. We, the administration, have spoken with religious leaders both inside the country and out. Prime Minister Abiy in earlier periods. Unfortunately, it does not appear that those engagements had much impact. We would hope that going forward that they would be listened to and heard and part of the conversation about bringing a solution to this problem. With respect to conflicts, you're quite right. There are other conflicts around the country which are quite serious, And we have engaged on those as well, both publicly and privately. But they do need attention because the country is increasingly experiencing ethnic and communal violence.
Thank you, Congressman, for your leadership on Ethiopia, not least of which the legislation around desert locust. I think, as you well know, Ethiopia is vulnerable to any number of humanitarian crises, not least of which desert locust and drought. It's why the crisis in Tigray is so gutting, is because this really is a man-made crisis, not like the crisis we see with the desert locust. There's one bright spot in Ethiopia is that we do feel like this year the threat of desert locust is receding, not least of which because of those strong investments in eradication and support for communities to counter locusts, but it's a chronic threat to Ethiopia. So welcome your continued engagement on this issue. And in terms of the churches growing out of that 1980, 83, 84 famine, very strong network of churches in Ethiopia that we partner with under the leadership of Catholic Relief Services on food assistance in particular, and are very much part of the response in Tigray.
If I had the time, I know that staging a response takes time. I know you've said about $1 billion is where this is all heading on the humanitarian side. How quickly can aid get to the people and hopefully safely to the people?
So we are already responding, as you said, at scale already, close to $500 million in Tigray alone. We are also working to bring other donors into this response. We've had a let's not wait and no regrets approach to scaling up assistance and scaling up fast, but we continue to press other donors to do the same.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Jerry Connolly of Virginia, who's the president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for holding this timely hearing. Welcome to our panel. Mr. Godek, are there still Eritrean troops in Tigray?
Yes, there's still Eritrean troops in Tigray.
And were they part of the troops that had to be evacuated from Mekelle, from the capital? Were they included, or was it just Ethiopian troops?
Given that their TPLF now appears to be in charge of Mekelle, I would assume there are no Eritrean troops at this time in Mekelle, but I can't give you a definitive answer, but I would suspect that's the case.
Are they working in tandem with Ethiopian troops, or are they, in fact, involved in separate operations under separate divisions?
Yes, I would say that the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces worked cooperatively. I mean, there were areas that were under one forces control, and sometimes.
So help us understand that a little bit. So the Eritrean-Ethiopian rivalry goes way back and has been violent on more than one occasion. What possessed the Eritreans or the Ethiopians to want to cooperate with respect to the Tigray operation?
Well, yes, there has been animosity between the Ethiopians and Eritreans, but it was specifically recently between the TPLF and the Eritreans. And that certainly the long war that took place was an example of that. And there was considerable animus between the government of Eritrea and the TPLF specifically. And of course, Prime Minister Abiy reached an agreement and understanding with the Eritreans and with President Isaias, which helped to lead to his Nobel Peace Prize. And I think there was an understanding or an agreement that the Eritreans would come in to support the government of Ethiopia when it began its operation against the TPLF in November. And I've already indicated some of the reasons for that cooperation, which took.
You indicated a little earlier that it was the United States government hope that the unilateral ceasefire announced by the Ethiopian government could be broadened, could be made permanent, and would involve all parties to the conflict. The Tigray forces that have repossessed their own capital, Mekelle, indicated that that's not part of their agenda and that they are going to continue to pursue the enemy, meaning Ethiopian military, indefinitely. What would be the motivation, given what's going on, for the Tigrayan forces to assent to your proposition? And secondly, can you address the perception that the need, or that what motivated the issuance of a unilateral ceasefire was the fact that the Ethiopian military was being outfought and outmaneuvered, and it was a face-saving way to retreat?
You know, I would urge the TPLF and the Tigrayan forces to, enter into, immediate discussions and to agree to a ceasefire. The scale of the humanitarian suffering in Tigray at the moment is such that the people need assistance. If the fighting continues, it's going to be more difficult to provide that humanitarian assistance. So now is the moment for all of the parties to come to an agreement that the fighting is going to come to an end. An inclusive dialogue needs to begin to address the underlying issues. At the end of the day, stability, security, peace, that is what is essential for the future of the country. And, I would hope that the TPLF would see that. Obviously, there's going to have to be investigations into the atrocities. There needs to be accountability for what happened. And I think, again, in the environment of a ceasefire and then ultimately inclusive dialogue, that can happen.
Is it in U.S. interest, or maybe I should frame it, is it not in U.S. interest that the cohesion of Ethiopia qua Ethiopia is absolutely something we care about?
Yeah.
That is to say, we don't want to see a breakaway province or independence, or we want to see this resolved peacefully, but we also want to see it remain integrated into Ethiopia as a whole, given its strategic importance and our relationship and so forth. And that would be my final question in the last 14 seconds.
Congressman, the answer is yes. The United States believes the territorial integrity and unity of Ethiopia is important, and we'll work toward that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Godek, for such a concise answer.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. I now recognize Representative Steve Shabbat of Ohio, who's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very timely hearing today. And as the ranking member of the Asian Pacific Subcommittee, I, not surprisingly, have a question relative to China and the conflict in Tigray. China likes to see itself as the rising global power, and a situation like this seems like it could be an opportunity for China to step up and maybe do something constructive for a change. Now, either through engagement, let's say, with the government of Ethiopia, or through multilateral forums, have they done anything thus far that would be constructive? And I would note, for example, that China's One Belt, One Road initiative has left many countries with huge debt, including Ethiopia. What could they do? What have they done, if anything?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. China does indeed have an extensive relationship with Ethiopia. It has significant commercial investments there in a wide range of areas. They've done construction, their commercial interests. So they have an extensive engagement. The Ethiopian government does owe China billions of dollars. So there's billions of dollars in debt. We have engaged with the Chinese over the Ethiopian situation, and specifically over the Tigray crisis. What I would indicate is that the Chinese believe, we have urged them to, for example, work with us at the Security Council to bring the matter before the Council. And so far they have indicated that they're not willing to do that.
So I think what I just heard you say is we've asked them to engage, and they consider this to be an internal matter, much like the Falun Gong and the Tibetans and the Uyghurs are all internal matters where they slaughter individuals, and that's internal to them. When they take over Hong Kong, which was arguably part of China to some degree, nonetheless, but the way they've cracked down was in violation of agreements that they made. So it sounds like you said they could step up and do some things constructive here, but thus far they have not.
I would say that's the case, Congressman.
Thank you. When you've been around this place as long as I've been, 25 years now, you wear a number of hats. So I also would ask you, wearing a different hat, I'm the co-chair of the Congressional Freedom of the Press caucus, along with my Democratic colleague from California, Adam Schiff. And so I'm interested in the media situation surrounding the conflict. And I understand that journalists have been, they faced harassments and threats and intimidation, and others have been detained because of their reporting or had their credentials revoked. What's the State Department doing to push for access and protection for journalists, including those who are helping to provide documentation with respect to the many atrocities which are being committed there? And we've already discussed sexual atrocities and rape and a whole range of other horribles. So what's the State Department doing to push for access and protection for those journalists?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. So I think when Prime Minister Abiy came into office, there was some loosening of controls on the press, some greater media freedom that we all welcomed. Unfortunately, that has been dramatically reversed. There is, as you indicated, pressure on journalists. There's harassment. Credentials have been revoked. Journalists have been imprisoned. They've been expelled. Simon Marks from the New York Times is one example of an international journalist, but the pressure is even greater on the local journalists. We have frequently raised this, both publicly and privately, to include with Prime Minister Abiy, both specific individual cases and the general situation of media freedom, and we have pressed for action on this front on a number of occasions, and we will continue to be both vocal publicly and privately about this matter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time's about ready to expire, so I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Ted Deutsch of Florida, who's the chair on the subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and global counterterrorism, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Ambassador Godek, Ms. Kelly. Like most of my colleagues, I'm deeply troubled by what we've seen unfold in Ethiopia. I thank the chair and Chairwoman Bass for their focus on this crisis. I was glad to see President Biden's appointment of Ambassador Feltman, highly accomplished diplomat in the special envoy role, showing the priority that this really requires, that this needs to be. And I just asked our two witnesses again to go back to find a way to really help understand or portray how horrific the situation is. And I'd like to just focus on children and on women. UNICEF reports more than 2.2 million children in northern Ethiopia are acutely food insecure, 140,000 among those currently in famine conditions. These are kids. Rates of malnutrition among pregnant and breastfeeding women surveyed are now consistently above 40% per UNICEF. And if the horrific situation facing children right now is not enough, UN officials, as has been alluded to, but I want to be clear about it because I feel like only the shocking information is going to cause the necessary attention that this receives. Widespread and systematic rape and sexual assault in Tigray, which UN officials said has been used as a weapon of war, referencing Ethiopian and Eritrean troops, Amhara special forces, and militias. I asked our witnesses, given the widespread suffering, given the really difficult situation, and given the shocking situation that kids and women in particular find themselves in, what do we do now that we have this moment of unilateral ceasefire to help ensure that the world's attention is really focused here, not just this committee, not just at this moment, but for the two of you who are focused on this all the time, how do we make this an issue that everyone needs to rightly be concerned about because of the way we should feel given everything that we've seen take place there? Ambassador?
Congressman, thank you for the question. It is very, very important, and indeed, I would agree, really critical that the world stay focused on this horrific crisis. You have quoted some truly terrible, terrible numbers. The scale of the suffering is unimaginable. And I would only say, we've been denied access to many regions, many parts of Tigray, and horribly, I suspect that we're going to find that the situation is even worse once we're on the ground. We need to continue to draw the world attention to this. We need to hold events like the one that the USAID administrator held last week or a week or two ago that really brought attention to this issue. We need to continue to hold hearings like this, and again, I welcome this and appreciate this hearing by the House Foreign Affairs Committee. We need to continue to work to seize the UN Security Council with this issue. We need to look for ways to raise this matter, and we need to look for ways to help the people who have been so tragically affected by this truly terrible crisis.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ms. Kelly?
Like you said, the scale of suffering is immense. I think, like many of my generation, we first learned the word famine in reference to Ethiopia in 1983, 1984. And once again, like you said, likely famine already happening in Ethiopia, risk of widespread famine for the first time since those 1983-84 famine in Ethiopia by the end of this year. I think this moment also gives us an opportunity, though, to remind people that it's not hopeless. If the parties do, we welcome the government's unilateral ceasefire. If all parties respect that ceasefire, we do have a window of opportunity to avert the worst, but that requires concerted action by all parties right now. We cannot wait.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member McCall, and I especially want to thank Chairman Bass and Ranking Member Smith. This issue needs to be front and center. That what we're seeing is horrific, and I'm so grateful to you for helping to shine a light on it today. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize my friend, Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding the hearing. Thanks for the folks that are here to testify. Ms. Charles, I'm interested in our partners, I guess. The American people, we're a generous lot, and we want to do all we can, and that's the right thing to do. And the description of what's happening, they're certainly horrific and invoke the things that we're doing. But we can't do this on our own. And quite honestly, I appreciate your positive attitude, Mr. Ambassador. I don't see the ceasefire holding, quite honestly, but God bless you. I hope it does, and I hope there is a window of opportunity. I guess, Ms. Charles, if the stated goal is to starve these people out, which seems to be one of the stated goals, how can we have any confidence that the food assistance that the United States is going to be sending, or that you have there ready to go, is going to get to the people in need? Like, we've seen this before, right? It's been hijacked. What provisions are in place on the ground to safeguard it, to get it there, and who else? What other countries are assisting the United States of America in completing this mission?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. Our first priority is to make sure that assistance gets to those that need it most. And when we talk about the food assistance, we work very closely with the World Food Program, with Catholic Relief Services, who runs the Joint Emergency Operations Center, put in place plans for end-to-end monitoring, which is not to say that there aren't incidents of armed actors in particular diverting that assistance, but we work very hard with them to avoid that wherever possible. I spend almost as much of my time thinking about the operation on the ground as I do talking to other donor counterparts, because we really do need more help from other donors. We have good partnership with the European Union, with the Germans, with other donors, but I'm working the phones all the time. to
What,
report
if
good
you don't mind my asking, where's the UN in this? And it sounds to me, with all due respect, like you're avoiding, the plan now is to avoid having the assistance stolen by armed actors, which it sounds to me like the region is full of them on all sides, right? And everybody's got a stake in this. Personally, I'm just not real confident in that. You know, I served in the United States military for 3 decades. You know, who's helping us keep away the armed actors that are going to steal the food and make sure it doesn't get to where we intend to have it get to? What's the plan for that?
Thank you. It's a very good question, and we do work very closely with the UN, not least of which the World Food Program, but also UN OCHA, UNICEF, and others. And this is where we really need the support and cooperation of the government of Ethiopia, of the ENDF, and now with the Tigrayan Defense Forces, to ensure again that assistance does get to those who need it the most.
Yeah, I got to tell you, with all, I know you're trying your heart out, and you have the best of intentions for the right reasons. I don't see a lot of upside for the Ethiopian government to help in this regard. I'm concerned for the people on the ground that are starving and being killed and being tortured and tormented and abused and all the things that you've discussed here. I'm also concerned for the American taxpayer who's sending this stuff, the supplies here with the best of intentions and their hearts in the right place, that's all going to be squandered because we don't have, when I say we, it's you folks and your partners, Ambassador, you folks, a good plan to safeguard it where it is and to safeguard its arrival to the location. If the stated goal is to starve these people out, the last thing they're going to want to do is allow you to do that. That's counterintuitive to what they're trying to accomplish here, horrific as it may be. And I don't know that you have the answer here, but I think that, you know, that with respect to the people that need the food and the respect that to the people that are going to be sending it there, which is the United States of America, we need to know, need to have some confidence that there is a plan and that plan will work. And I'm happy to have your comments.
I also want to be clear that we don't just drop the food off and
No,
leave them.
I didn't think you did, but yeah.
Our partners are working to reach the people that they can in places where they can monitor that food assistance, that they can make sure that it's getting to the most vulnerable. When we talk about those 1 million people that are out of reach of our assistance, that's in large part because those are places where our partners can't operate, can't trust that they can get the food to the people that they need, that they can't operate unharassed by those armed actors. So unfortunately, there are people that are very much out of reach of assistance because of what you described. But in terms of safeguarding what's in country, we work very closely with our partners to ensure that it's done in a responsible manner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Karen Bass of California, who is the distinguished chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ambassador and Ms. Charles. You know, I represent a district in Los Angeles that has a large Ethiopian community, and the community really does not believe that the Abiy government has committed the atrocities, and they believe that actually the Tigrayans are responsible for a lot of the crimes. I joined them, and I was so excited when he took over. And I know Representative Smith and I went and spent time with him. I was thrilled when he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so the reality of what is happening on the ground now is very troubling. And I wanted to ask if you would please speak to my constituents, because they want to know what proof you have that the Ethiopian government is not just responding in a defensive manner because of the attack, the acts against humanity. Do the Tigrayans have any responsibility? But they really would like to understand what proof there is. So I know my constituents are watching this hearing, and I would really appreciate it if both of you would speak to them. Especially because you mentioned that we don't have access. So how do we know what's going on?
To some areas, we don't have access. Congresswoman, thank you very much for the question, and thank you for all of your extraordinary work on Africa. It is quite welcome. We did indeed, all of us, I think, welcome Prime Minister Abiy when he came to office, the reforms that he put in place, the move towards democracy, opening up, and welcome the Nobel Peace Prize for him. Unfortunately, what's happened is truly, it's more than unfortunate, it is truly horrible, the conflict in Tigray. It is a catastrophe. The conflict broke out as a consequence of a long series of disagreements, conflicts, difficulties between the government, the central government, and the government in Tigray, in Mekelle, the TPLF. There were a number of mistakes on both sides, a number of things that really pushed the conflict. It is clear that the TPLF did launch the initial attack in November on Ethiopian National Defense Forces bases. Nevertheless, the response by the government, clearly everything that has happened since, the atrocities and all of the other things have been truly horrible. We have been in the process of doing this fact-based and law-based review. We have documented a number of atrocities. We've by the government and by the.
How have we documented them? How do we know?
We review quite a bit of information, which we receive through many different channels, and we verify that the information is accurate. We have a wide range of sources, both public and not public, and we do look very carefully at what has happened. Obviously, we look at the reports from Human Rights Watch and from other organizations, and there is no question but that the government of Ethiopia, their forces, the Eritrean government forces, the Amharan forces, and the TPLF as well, have committed human rights violations, abuses, and even atrocities. All parties to this have unquestionably committed violations.
And Ms. Charles, especially around famine, how do we know this?
Well, and I'll also speak to our humanitarian partners are there to provide services, not investigate atrocities, but they do have women presenting in mobile clinics, as well as our partners across the border in Sudan are having women presenting, having been raped with organ damage, telling horrific stories about gang rape and sexual violence.
By who?
By armed actors. We have reports of any number of armed actors, whether it be the Eritrean Defense Forces or the ENDF or Amharic Special Forces.
And the famine? And when you said it was man-made, so who caused the famine?
Yeah.
And how do we know this?
So the famine, we have several different sources to make famine determinations to analyze the depth of food insecurity. Some of it is survey work, some of it is children presenting malnourished in those mobile clinics and those mobile supplemental feeding sites. In terms of the who's responsible, we see both. The crisis started at a time of harvest, and so harvest was interrupted last fall. But subsequently, we've seen, particularly this spring, the explicit blocking of Tigrayans from farming their lands and the blocking of food assistance to Tigrayans.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Darrell Issa of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in your opening remarks, you used the term, rightfully so, that Ethiopia is one of our closest and most powerful allies in Africa. The other close and powerful ally in Africa certainly would include Egypt, wouldn't it, Ambassador?
Yes, Egypt is an important partner.
Well, let's run through that. Currently, we have atrocities going on on both sides. Currently, Ethiopia enjoys about $1,000 per capita of GDP, and Sudan less. Essentially, this is an area of great poverty, even in good times. These are not good times. But let's go through, if the dam is completed and Ethiopia chooses to fill it at the rate that they're threatening to, and that negotiations have not yet settled, the impact to Egypt, at a minimum, and I think this is a question for both of you, would certainly be equally dire and devastating. Certainly more than 1 million people would suddenly be thrown into adverse poverty and starvation. Wouldn't that be a fair prediction if the water of the Nile is cut off?
Congressman, clearly, a cutoff of the water to the Nile would be a major problem.
Right. So, I mean, a filling faster than what would be the flow that would allow the sustaining of the Nile, any filling faster than that would be devastating to the 100 million people of Egypt, correct?
Well, Congressman, I think what I would emphasize is that there are solutions to this problem.
I'm fine with that, Ambassador. I guess here's my point. Today, we are looking at $500 million in aid. We're looking at a dire situation. We're looking at mass atrocities. We're looking at starvation. All of this between two parts of a single country, as compared to two 100 million plus population countries that, if those two powerful militaries go to war, will this will pale in comparison. Would that be fair to say?
I certainly think that war in the region between any of these countries would be catastrophic.
So, concentrating on this, I mean, the people before me have, and quite frankly, covered a lot of the matters. And so when we get to me, I want to cover something that I think has been mentioned but not covered. You know, the statement was, we're using our best efforts, we're highly engaged. What is the understanding of these two parties that the United States' position would be to prevent what would be tens or hundreds of billions of dollars of aid we would be needing, millions of lives displaced, and probably similar numbers killed? Because that appears to be the apocalyptic but fair assessment of what would happen if, in an effort to get hydroelectric power, Ethiopia, with its large military, begins filling any faster than what Egypt can tolerate.
Congressman, thank you for the question. What I would emphasize is that there are solutions, technical solutions, that address the concerns of all of the parties, that allow Ethiopia to build the dam and have electricity, that allows Egypt to have water, that allows Sudan to have water, and meets the needs of all of the people of the region. The issue is really a question of political will. The leaders in these countries have to come to an agreement. The United States supports the process led by the African Union, and there's also been deep engagement recently by the United Arab Emirates, which has been helpful. Special Envoy
my
Feltman.
time is expiring. Let me just ask one follow-up question. At this point, the upstream and the only one that can control whether something reasonable in these alternatives is done is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has essentially all the levers. What is it that this Nobel Prize winner, who is engaged in this regional dispute within his own country, what is it that he or his government is doing that gives you some faith that we are going to not just explore, but attain one of these viable alternatives to devastation to two other countries?
Congressman, we continue to urge the Prime Minister and the members of the government of Ethiopia to reach an agreement. We believe it is ultimately in the best interests of the people of Ethiopia to have an agreement, and that allows them to finish the dam, to do the other sorts of things that they want to do to develop their country, and that there not be some sort of regional problems over this issue. There is no need for these difficulties. There are resolutions, and we're going to continue to work on this. Special Envoy Feltman was just in the region. He's just returned, and he was working specifically on this matter, and he and others in the administration will continue to do so.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Ambassador Feltman, with his time in Israel, his time in Lebanon, he seems to always be in the right place for the wrong, at the wrong time, but I have great faith in him. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative David Cicilline of Rhode Island for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this really important hearing and obviously very timely. And thank you to our witnesses for your service and for your testimony. The crisis in Tigray and in multiple parts of Ethiopia has resulted in some of the worst atrocities the world has seen this century. Scores of civilians have lost their lives, sexual and gender-based violence is rampant, and millions are at risk of severe malnutrition as famine conditions threaten to spread across the country. And the world must not turn a blind eye and must do all it can to foster a peaceful conclusion to hostilities and to provide the humanitarian assistance to the people in this region that will allow them to survive. And so my first question is to you, Ms. Charles. There's been so much evidence and testimony today about gender-based violence and sexual violence, and we know that that's been very present in this conflict, leaving many women, girls, and other vulnerable populations at risk, and so often leaving little accountability for the perpetrators. Could you speak to what USAID is doing and other relevant agencies and organizations to provide victims of sexual violence the support that they need? Is there counseling available? Are there safe houses? Is medical care available? And what is the status of the response to this sexual violence?
Thank you for your question. As you mentioned, the scale of sexual violence in this crisis is horrific, and really has been protection of survivors has been at the center of our response from the beginning, and that's training of social workers, providing safe spaces, counseling services for survivors. And we're able to do this at scale in places where we have access, mainly the major cities in Tigray. But our ability to provide those services in a sustained way is hindered by the continued constraints on access.
Thank you. Ambassador Godek, what is the Ethiopian government doing, if anything, to protect refugees from Eritrea that are currently on Ethiopian soil? Has the Ethiopian government, for example, provided assurances that they are doing all they can to curtail the reported activities of the Eritrean military forces stationed in Ethiopia as it relates to refugees, which have been reported to include kidnapping, murders, and even forced repatriation? And so what's the current status of the refugee population?
Congressman, thank you for the question. So the United States is obviously deeply concerned about the protection of refugees. We have raised the importance of the protection of refugees with the government of Ethiopia, to include Prime Minister, on a number of different occasions, and reminded him that he has obligations under international law that must be observed. We are obviously providing a range of assistance ourselves, and others are doing so through UNHCR and other organizations. Clearly, there have been abuses. At least 2 camps in northern Tigray were destroyed. There are still Eritrean refugees who cannot be located. There are a number of efforts underway to address this situation, but clearly the government of Ethiopia has obligations that it needs to live up to protect the Eritrean and other refugees that are in the country. Ethiopia has currently about 800,000 or so refugees in the country.
Thank you, Ambassador. I hope that message, and I'm certain it is, will be repeated to the Ethiopian government over and over again. And my final question, Mr. Ambassador, is, so often when we see conflicts like this, there's a sense that, the perpetrators somehow escape accountability. And so how can the United States foster greater UN Security Council engagement with the conflict, particularly to ensure that there is accountability for ongoing atrocities?
Thank you, Congressman. The United States strongly believes that the UN Security Council should have an open discussion on this matter. There have already been several any other business and also an interactive dialogue discussion of the crisis, but more is needed. There should be an open discussion. This crisis is a threat to regional peace and security, and it really requires and deserves, and frankly, it is very unfortunate that there has not been an open council discussion. Beyond that, though, we are looking at other mechanisms, both to investigate and to hold accountable individuals who commit atrocities or human rights violations. We've supported the effort by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Office of the High Commissioner Human Rights to investigate. That is an investigation, though. It's not holding people accountable. So we hope that investigation will be completed. We are providing financial support for it. We will be keeping an eye on it to ensure that it is a genuine investigation that reveals what happened. And the next step after that is to find mechanisms to hold people to account for their actions. And we will look to do that in a variety of ways. And in fact, have already begun the process.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Adam Kinzinger of Illinois for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the panel for being here today. It's a really important issue, obviously. Mr. Godek, many analysts have predicted that extended conflict between the
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I'm
two
having
re-
difficulty hearing the question.
Mr. Kinzinger, can you speak up?
Yeah, I'm trying. What about now? How's this? All right, I'll have to come back then if it's not working.
All right. Who's next?
Go
We'll
to
come
the
back.
next one, that's fine.
Mr. Kinzinger, are you still there?
I'm here, but if you can't hear me, you can go to the next one.
Can you hear him now?
Yeah, I can hear him now. It's very faint. Perhaps, Congressman, if you could just speak up a bit, maybe.
I'll try to speak up. How's this?
Thank you.
That's much better.
That's better.
Okay. Many analysts have predicted that extended conflict between the TPLF and Prime Minister Ahmad will cause a sharp decrease in foreign investment. They're a major contributor to Ethiopia's national economy. Amidst ongoing economic strains caused by the pandemic and economic crisis would make an already dire situation catastrophic. How can the U.S. support continued foreign investment into key national industries while holding those who have committed atrocities accountable for their crimes?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Look, the United States, continues to want to help the Ethiopian people. You can see that in our assistance in a variety of ways. We continue to provide support, whether it's, for example, health support or other assistance to the people of Ethiopia. Our concern at the moment, obviously, however, is that given the scale of the atrocities, given the scale of what's happened, actions that would directly benefit the government of Ethiopia at this moment are more of a challenge. We continue to have U.S. businesses and others operating in the country. We continue to provide them support and assistance, but clearly it can't be business as usual given the scope and the scale of the horror of what's happened in Tigray.
Well, let me ask you too, how do you expect a protracted conflict or an economic crisis in Ethiopia to impact broader regional stability in the Horn of Africa?
I think if the conflict continues, Congressman, that it will drive further displacement of individuals. There'll be further potential for refugee flows, particularly if the conflict expands. We've already seen a small flow of refugees, for example, into Kenya from Oromia. We've seen a flow into Sudan from Beni Shangul, and there is the possibility for greater displacement. I think the big risk is that the conflict becomes even greater and spreads more widely and really spins out of control. In that case, that would destabilize the entire region and pose risks not just to the neighbors, but frankly more widely up through the Red Sea region and further.
And let me ask you too, since the hostilities have started, we've gotten reports that multiple actors have committed appalling atrocities, as you well know, in Tigray, including civilian massacres, rapes, lootings, destruction of property, including schools, hospitals, and churches. How can we help to facilitate, we being the United States, help to facilitate peace agreements between the TPLF and the government without negating the crime? So in essence, still holding people accountable.
Thank you, Congressman. The first step, as I've indicated, is a permanent ceasefire that's achieved through negotiation and discussion. That is essential. That's the starting point. We are in touch with all of the parties to this conflict. We are urging them to, as I said, agree to a cessation of hostilities, put it in place, and after that, to allow full humanitarian access, unhindered humanitarian access to help the people in need. As part of that as well, we will facilitate and assist with investigations such as the one being carried out by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN. And we will look at whether other investigations can be supported, and we will hold people to account. I think we can do all of these things. Obviously, it's going to require some time, but the first step is a full ceasefire.
Yeah, thank you. I have a few more questions I'll just submit for the record, but they're somewhat repetitive to the point that I think a ceasefire is important. Getting to negotiating, creating real, political stability as best we can. We obviously have a very strong voice there. It's important that we recognize that and use it. I appreciate all the good work you're doing, Mr. Chairman, and because of the technical difficulties, I'll yield back the last minute.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Dina Titus of Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank our guests for being with us today. I'd like to follow up on a couple of questions that were asked previously. One was asked by Mr. Shabbat. We were talking about how China's investment in Ethiopia has kept them from being less cooperative when it comes to ending the conflict. I wonder what the motivation might be, if you've looked at, or I'm sure you have, of Russia and India as also not being helpful or acting as roadblocks in this process.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Both Russia and India have also opposed action at the UN Security Council, open hearings, discussions at the Council on this. I think in those instances as well, they prefer to see the Tigray crisis as an internal conflict as a result of their own situations, perhaps, or perhaps as a result of relations that they have with the government of Ethiopia. We do continue to urge them, as we urge everybody, to engage on this issue, though. The stability and long-term territorial integrity of Ethiopia is at risk, and we would urge and encourage all partners and all friends of Ethiopia to press the government to take steps for an inclusive dialogue and to address the crisis in Tigray.
Well, speaking of territorial integrity, you said earlier that you're committed to maintaining the existing borders of Ethiopia. I wonder what the U.S. is actually doing to try to address some of these other nationalist groups that are where there's unrest, or they're starting to pop up, or there's some threat around the edges in Ethiopia.
We've certainly engaged, Congresswoman, with the Prime Minister and with a wide range of other actors in Ethiopia on this question. We've done so privately, we've done so publicly, we've encouraged an inclusive dialogue. Beyond that, however, we have put in place a range of programs through USAID and other organizations to help address the drivers of conflict across the country. There are border disputes, long-time grievances that remain in place. And so we have sought through these programs to address the problems. We also have engagements to address the problem of hate speech, work in that area and work in other areas. I don't know if Assistant Administrator Charles wants to say something about, for example, some of our programs to address this through USAID.
Thank you.
Yes, a lot of our work in Ethiopia is around working with youth and women's groups to address intercommunal violence, to also support independent media and other actors in the civil society that can help again with local conflict resolution.
Did any of these NGOs or any of your programs address the ethnic conflicts that are internal in Ethiopia?
Yes, much of that work that I just described is really about looking at the root causes and very local level dynamics around intercommunal violence, ethnic violence, trying to build bridges among the youth and women in particular.
What about any kind of political programs that encourage democracy or participation or legislative processes, rule of law that include all different ethnic groups?
Historically, USAID has provided support to electoral processes, expanding political participation, independent media, civil society, all aimed at building kind of that democratic muscle in Ethiopia.
You think it's working?
I'll defer that question to Ambassador Godek.
Eh, Let's just say we continue to work at the problem. It is a challenge. Ethiopia has a way to go yet, unfortunately.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Representative Tim Burchett of Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that. And thank you all for being here. With reports of clashes between the Sudanese and Ethiopian forces at El Fashaga and joint military exercises between Egypt and Sudan, is there a chance that this conflict evolves into a regional war?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, the Al Fashaga border dispute poses a risk of conflict in the area. It is a deep dispute, and it is of considerable concern to the United States. It is something that we have discussed with both Addis Ababa and Khartoum, with leaders in both countries, urging them to find a solution. But it is a risk.
Okay. Has the conflict negatively affected the anti-al-Shabaab efforts in Somalia?
The Ethiopians do provide troops to AMISOM in support of the efforts to, address the threat from al-Shabaab in Somalia. They had also provided some additional, maybe 4,000 or so bilateral forces, so outside of the AMISOM construct. Those bilateral forces, we believe, have largely been withdrawn. So far, we don't assess that there's been much impact on the effort to address the problem of al-Shabaab, the withdrawal of those Ethiopian forces. But it is obviously something that we are continuing to monitor and look at very closely.
Okay. Sudan has stated that they are concerned about Ethiopian UN peacekeeping forces stationed in Abyei. Do they have a right to be worried?
I think that the situation with those forces has changed, and it is something, though, that we are looking at and also engaged with the Sudanese on. It is a concern.
Okay. Administrator Power said that over 900,000 people are currently experiencing famine in Ethiopia. What are the biggest obstacles to that humanitarian response effort?
We do believe about 900,000 people are facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. The concerns have really been blocking of access by the armed actors in Tigray, as well as some bureaucratic obstacles provided by the government of Ethiopia. With the unilateral ceasefire declared yesterday, we're hopeful that that may potentially open up access to reach those people that have been out of reach. But we need a lifting of the communications blackout that's currently on Tigray right now. We need the Amharic regional forces to remove checkpoints from the 3 main access roads. And we also need the TPLF, which now controls quite a lot of territory, to allow for that unhindered access as well.
Okay. Thank you all. I'll yield back the remainder of time. Before I do, my neighbor, his daughter adopted a beautiful little girl from Ethiopia. Her name's Anna, and just an incredible little girl. And I sure would hope that they could find some peace in that region. Just would be my wish for that. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you, brother.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back his time. I now recognize Representative Susan Wild of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I'd like to direct my question to Ambassador Godek. As tensions with Egypt and Sudan over the Grand Renaissance Dam project continue to rise, might you be able to provide an update on the administration's attempts to address the dispute? I'm concerned that with so many actors, both countries and organizations getting involved now, that it's going to be particularly difficult for the administration to devise a strategy for achieving an equitable resolution and avoiding additional escalation. Just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So the United States is engaged on the issue of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Special Envoy Feltman was just on a trip where he met with a number of key actors who are engaged in trying to resolve the problem. As I indicated earlier, we do believe that there are technical solutions that allow all the parties to get what they want, Ethiopia to get electricity, Sudan and Egypt to get water. We believe and have been supportive of the African Union-led process. We are engaged in talking to President Tshisekedi. Special Envoy Feltman just met with him. The United Arab Emirates has also been engaged, have some UN agencies. We're in constant communication with them. Proposals have been put forward and are being developed that would, I think, resolve this matter. But again, it's a question of political will more than technical solutions. The technical solutions are available. So we will continue to press the parties to agree to technical solutions, which again, I think meet the needs of all of the parties.
Thank you. And switching gears, assuming a ceasefire in the short term, does the administration have a plan to work with the African Union and regional governments to support some kind of political settlement in the medium to long term?
Congresswoman, yes, thank you. We are certainly very much engaged with the African Union and all of the regional governments. We're in almost constant communication with the AU and with regional partners, with like-minded partners in Europe and elsewhere. We have been looking at the question of how to facilitate a political dialogue, an inclusive dialogue, and really also address specifically the situation of Tigray. We have offered a number of models and suggestions on how progress might be made on these challenges. And we hope that the government will take up these suggestions and ideas. We are going to remain engaged, very much committed to finding a resolution to this. And we hope to move this interim ceasefire to a permanent ceasefire and again, begin the work that needs to be done to provide relief.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Representative Dan Muser of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Thank you to both of you for being here with us. As was mentioned, yesterday, the ENDF forces withdrew from Tigray and declared, I understand, an immediate and unilateral ceasefire. Why did that happen, Ambassador?
I'm sorry.
What caused that to happen?
What caused that to happen? Congressman, there's still a lot that we don't know for certain, but what I can say is this. Clearly, the TPLF, or really the TDF, the Tigrayan Defense Forces, have in the past couple of weeks achieved some military victories, particularly in central Tigray. They were clearly advancing toward Mekelle, so there were some military successes by the Tigrayans. At the same time, I would also just note that there had been discussions as well about the possibility of a ceasefire. Earlier, there have been indications that the government of Ethiopia wanted to take steps after the June 21st election to resolve the crisis there. So I can't give you a definitive answer as to what caused this particular announcement, but there clearly are factors involved.
Okay, thanks. If Tigray laid down its arms, would that bring ceasefire or escalate hostilities?
If the Tigrayans laid down their arms, you know, our objective again is a permanent ceasefire, a negotiated ceasefire that really gets the parties to the table to address the deeper underlying issues of Ethiopia. So it is absolutely essential to have the conflict end. There are clear ways to do that, I think, and we are engaged with all of the parties to help push them in that direction.
Sure. On the flip side of that, if the ENDF were to lay down its arms, would that create continued escalation, or would that maybe bring a ceasefire?
Well, I think that the ENDF has again indicated that they are in a ceasefire mode. So effectively, they've said that they're not going to continue the conflict. We do need to see from the other parties, the Eritreans and from the TPLF, a commitment to a ceasefire.
As far as access for humanitarian purposes into Tigray, are we just stopped because of it's such a warlike atmosphere?
There's been a pause in the last 48 hours, given developments, but even starting today and certainly tomorrow, we expect many of our partners to start testing this ceasefire and seeing if they can reach populations that we haven't been able to reach in the past.
Thank you. And question for, I'll go back to the ambassador. The Russia and China, what role are they playing in Ethiopia?
Well, the Chinese in particular have big investments in Ethiopia. China holds billions of dollars of Ethiopian debt. The Chinese have built infrastructure projects, invested in commercial engagements, manufacturing, and other things. But the Chinese, when we have engaged with them over this issue, have, indicated that they believe this is an internal matter for Ethiopia.
Right. Would you be able to say they're being more supportive of, well, peace, hopefully, but on the Ethiopian government, the ENDF side, or Tigrayans?
What I would hope is that the Chinese and indeed all, countries, friends and partners of Ethiopia will engage in a fashion that helps bring all of the parties together in a way that is productive and which, again, achieves a long-term solution to the problems. That is certainly what we're going to be urging the Chinese, the Russians, in addition to neighbors, like-minded partners, and everyone else to do.
Right. Do you find that they are making themselves available and are accessible to the U.S., keeping you updated, as well as very much desire your and our involvement in helping resolve the situation?
We have engaged with the Chinese and continue to do so on this issue and on Ethiopia in a variety of forums in a variety of ways. So we are speaking with them.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Dean Phillips of Minnesota for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greetings to our witnesses, and thank you for being with us. It's heartbreaking and infuriating, frankly, to watch a Nobel Peace Prize winner so quickly migrate to an enabler at best, perhaps, an architect at worst of the worst humanitarian crises of this era. And I have to say, it's equally infuriating and heartbreaking that the world's most well-resourced nation, our United States, seems unwilling or unable to stop it. But I need not cover that ground because I think it has been covered already. I wish to talk about the recent elections on June 21st. Took place against the backdrop of horrible instability, of course, some estimating that up to a quarter of the regular electorate was either unwilling or unable to participate. The boycott of the elections by opposition parties, detention of vocal political leaders, and ongoing violence across the country highlight the erosion of democratic governance in Ethiopia. So, Mr. Ambassador, to you, in early May, the Ethiopian government, of course, designated both the TPLF and the OLA as terrorist organizations. So how does that designation change the prospects for a peaceful political environment and a healthy democracy in Ethiopia?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We don't share the view that the TPLF and the OLF should have been designated as terrorist groups. We certainly have not done so ourselves at this point. Obviously, that also, for example, raised the difficulty of getting humanitarian assistance into these areas in some instances. And so it was problematic. What we would urge at this point, the government of Ethiopia, is just the importance of talking with the various organizations to include, all of the actors in the country, certainly all those that have engaged in the conflict in Tigray, and find a way forward. There needs to be this inclusive dialogue, and it needs to involve the parties. And without that, the country is at risk of further destabilization. The election that took place on June 21st, you know, again, we commend those Ethiopians who choose to take part in it, but we certainly agree that it was not free or fair for most Ethiopians. And it is not the solution to the country's problems. It's a one-off event. There needs to be an inclusive dialogue that resolves the underlying issues that many of the people in the country have.
I know I speak for many of my colleagues when I say we agree. With the remainder of my time, I want to ask about Hakalu Hundessa, of course, the Oromno activist and singer who was assassinated 1 year ago today. In August of 2020, a year ago, I sent a letter with 19 of my colleagues requesting a transparent and independent investigation into his murder. In October, last October, the State Department responded by saying, quote, "The government of Ethiopia condemned Hundessa's killing and is conducting thorough investigations into both his killing and the violence that followed to ensure those culpable are brought to justice. The department has observed thus far that judicial processes and the treatment of detainees has proceeded in a manner that is broadly consistent with international law and Ethiopia's political reform priorities, albeit with the challenges due to COVID-19, end quote. So a lot has changed clearly since last October, but how would you characterize the current judicial process and the treatment of detainees, particularly opposition leaders right now?
So broadly speaking, Congressman, we're continue to have concerns, obviously, about the political environment in Ethiopia. And there have been detentions of a number of politicians, a number of other activists and others. We have engaged with the government on these detentions. We strongly believe that it's essential that any legal process proceed in accord with the rule of law. We have sought, in some instances, access to individuals, not always had the opportunity for that access. But it is critically important in this environment that no one be persecuted or prosecuted simply because of their political views, and that any legal process, again, be conducted in accordance with the rule of law.
And are you aware of the status at all of the independent investigation into Hakulu's murder specifically?
Congressman, I'd have to get back to you on that specific question, and I'd be happy to do so.
We'd welcome it. Thank you very much to both of you for being here. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative August Pfluger of Texas, who's the vice ranking member for the Subcommittee on Europe, Energy, Environment, and Cyber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for your time today. I think the conflict that we're seeing is on pace to become one of the worst humanitarian crises in decades. And there's estimates that place the number of people suffering from man-made drought conditions at almost 1 million, maybe more. I think it only underscores the critical need for the recently announced ceasefire to hold during such critical times as this farming season is upcoming. And we not only need to address the mounting humanitarian crisis, but a return to stability. And just as a precursor for either of you, do you see a clear offender and defender role in this crisis in military parlance?
Congressman, what I would say is that all sides have committed acts, atrocities, provocations, other sorts of things which have been extremely problematic. Clearly, however, the response of the Ethiopian Defense Forces, the Eritrean Defense Forces, and the Amhara forces and militias following the attack in early November by the TPLF, it has been it's created huge issues, and there can be no excuse for the human rights violations, abuses, and atrocities that have been committed. There is no possible justification.
So I guess
that have happened.
To summarize, is there an offender and a defender, or is it more atrocities on both sides that both are wrong from your perspective?
I would say both sides have committed acts which are a major problem. And
so the Horn of Africa not only is of high strategic importance to the United States and our allies and partners, but also that of our adversaries. We've seen China grow in their malign influence on the continent and establish their first forward naval base
in neighboring Djibouti. And where we find instability, particularly in these very strategic locations, we often find that our adversaries will be there to exploit the circumstances and further their own malign agenda. I know these questions have been asked in a variety of forms, but I'm very interested in understanding from your perspective where those specific vulnerabilities lie for countries such as China to exploit, whether it's leveraging debt, whether it's leveraging the instability, the political instability, the military use of force, and how that affects not only our bilateral relationship, but our own interest.
Well, Congressman, I don't think that, deep conflict and instability in Ethiopia would be beneficial to China or indeed to anyone. As I'd indicated earlier, the Chinese do have extensive commercial relationships, investments. They do hold substantial billions of dollars worth of Ethiopian debt. I don't think that anyone would benefit, from broad instability and chaos in Ethiopia and across the region. There might be some who would seek to exploit it if it did take place, but we are going to work to ensure that it doesn't.
Well, that's good to hear. Ms. Charles, for you, just on the food security side, what do you see if this ceasefire doesn't hold? I mean, obviously unilateral in nature, but if it doesn't hold, what is the outlook for food security inside Ethiopia this summer and into the remainder of the year?
As you mentioned, we already have 900,000 people we estimate are in catastrophic conditions of food insecurity, a further nearly 2 million in emergency levels of food insecurity. If this cessation of hostilities doesn't hold, if we don't see unobstructed access, we're facing widespread famine by the end of the year.
And will it affect outside of the borders of Ethiopia, the region writ large, or will it be localized?
The extreme levels of food insecurity that we're seeing are concentrated in Tigray, but there's no question that level of food insecurity, death could have regional impacts.
Assistant Secretary, for your question for you, I mean, what are the chances that the cessation of hostilities actually holds?
Congressman, all I can tell you is we're going to do everything we can to persuade the parties to have it hold, and that all parties agree to a cessation of hostilities. We will work toward that end.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Social Impact. For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and apologies for retreading anything that we've covered. I had another hearing, as I know others have been in and out as well. But just yesterday, the Ethiopian government declared an immediate unilateral ceasefire after Tigrayan fighters recaptured Mekelle, a significant setback for the Ethiopian government. There's a lot of uncertainty over the situation, and I'm looking for some clarity on where we are and what we can expect. And I understand that many thousands of Ethiopian troops have been captured by advancing Tigrayan forces. Can you confirm this? And how many Ethiopian prisoners are we looking at, and how are they being treated?
Congressman, the situation indeed is very fluid, and there are lots of questions about what is precisely happening on the ground. We are working to get better information, but I don't have specific numbers at the moment in terms of Ethiopian troops which may have been captured by the TDF.
But you confirm that there have been some number of troops that have been captured?
Congressman, I would have to get back to you. I don't have confirmation at the moment that that's the case.
Okay. In May, the administration levied visa sanctions on Ethiopian, Eritrean, Amhara, and Tigrayan leaders. In his statement, Secretary Blinken said that despite, quote, significant diplomatic engagement, the parties to the conflict in Tigray have taken no meaningful steps to end hostilities or pursue a peaceful resolution of the political crisis, unquote. What has been the effect of those sanctions? Have the sanctioned individuals or the countries and organizations they work for changed behavior as a result of the sanction? And how are you measuring the effectiveness of these sanctions?
Congressman, thank you for the question. We're obviously looking very closely at the actions, not just the words, of the parties and the organizations that were subject to the sanctions regime or that are part of the sanctions regime. You know, clearly this step to put in place an interim ceasefire, you know, hopefully it's a positive step. We welcome it, but it's at the very beginning of a process. So we need to see real progress towards meaningful peace, a restoration of security, humanitarian access, accountability for crimes that have been committed before, you know, we're going to be in a position to change what we're doing. At the moment, Congressman, you know, Ethiopia has before it really two roads. It can either begin to pull itself out of this crisis and address the issues and meet the needs of the people, or you know, they can choose to go the other route and continue the conflict. And if that's the choice that they make, then we will continue to use the tools that are available to us, to include visa sanctions and many other you know, potential sanctions that are available in order to encourage progress.
But I just, so we don't have an assessment at this point yet of whether we think those sanctions are having the intended effect or whether they're working.
Obviously, it's only been, what, just about a month or so, a little bit more since that sanctions regime was announced, so it's still early.
Sure. Then UN Relief Chief Mark Lowcock has gone on the record describing the situation in Tigray as a famine, and the World Food Program, 50,000 people in Tigray are at risk of famine. Despite the suffering, the Ethiopian government refuses to acknowledge this reality. And I'm also concerned about the role the Ethiopian government is playing in perpetuating or exacerbating the famine. And so my question is, how do you assess the Ethiopian government's response to famine in Tigray? Is there any evidence that they or the Eritrean government are using famine and hunger as pressure to starve Tigray into submission? And the situation in Ethiopia seems to meet the definition of famine by all accounts.
We certainly share the assessment and actually have updated our own analysis to reflect upwards of 800 to 900,000 people are facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity, a further 2 million facing emergency levels. So we're incredibly concerned. We believe famine is likely already occurring in Ethiopia, and widespread famine is likely by the end of the year if we don't have unobstructed access.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I just want to check, is Mr. Jackson, I know he was having, Representative Jackson of Texas, is he on? He was having technical difficulties. Mr. Jackson, can you hear me? Okay. I now recognize then Representative Andy Levin of Michigan, the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Asia, Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this really timely, unfortunately timely hearing. The UK's Telegraph published shocking images of weapons experts who said the burns look consistent with the use of white phosphorus, which is not technically considered a chemical weapon, but is banned under international law from use on human targets. The Ethiopian government denied the report forcefully. Ambassador Godek, are you aware of the reported use of white phosphorus against civilians?
Congressman, yes, we are aware of the reports. We've certainly seen them. What I can tell you is that in all cases where we see reports, we do like this, particularly reports that a particularly heinous act has been committed. We do take a close look at that and use our best available means, and we look to determine whether or not the reports are accurate. In many of these instances, it's been difficult, however, because we do not have unimpeded access to large areas in Tigray, of course.
So you haven't been able to make an assessment as to the validity yet. Does the State Department have the mechanisms in place to assess reports like this independently if you do have access to the area?
We do have a range of ways in which we can determine the validity of reports of atrocities. Obviously, to some degree, we also rely on other organizations. As I've indicated earlier, for example, we're providing support to the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to conduct an investigation. So we rely on a variety of mechanisms and ways. We have tools.
Let me go to my next question because I wanted to ask you something related to that. As you know, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has partnered with the government-appointed Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to investigate human rights abuses in Tigray. Many Tigrayans question the credibility of an investigation that includes the EHRC in this way. So, based on what you said before, should I assume that you're confident in this investigation's independence you have confidence in the EHRC and in an investigation they would undertake?
Congressman, we do have the UN and in the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, but I will say this, we are going to be monitoring and looking at this situation very closely. We are aware that it is possible to put organizations and individuals under great pressure, and it's important that there ultimately be an independent investigation. If we determine it's not independent, we will say so, and we will take steps to work to ensure that an independent investigation takes place.
All right, well, I would appreciate it if you'd follow up with me on that particular question, because I'm very concerned about the question of the EHRC's independence.
We certainly will follow up, Congressman.
Thank you very, very much. So we've heard a lot about the challenges around humanitarian access to Tigray, obviously, and I was really alarmed to learn about the dangers facing humanitarian actors that do gain access to the region. And it's my understanding that at least 9 humanitarian aid workers have been killed in Tigray, including a USAID partner staff member. Ms. Charles, what can you tell us about efforts to protect humanitarian workers in Tigray and on a road forward for that work?
Thank you for that question. And we know of actually at least 12 humanitarian aid workers that have been killed since the start of this crisis, and are very focused on supporting our humanitarian partners with their own security planning. But we've also been calling for a scale up in UN security support, as well as really, and this is critical right now, a lifting of the communications blackout that's currently facing Tigray, and allowing for the importation of communication equipment that's so essential for allowing our humanitarian partners to move around Tigray with the best possible information.
Have most that have been killed by Ethiopian government forces and EPLF, or who's killing these humanitarian workers?
So not all of the humanitarian workers that I've mentioned have been killed have been killed directly by armed actors, although certainly we have indications that our partner staff with REACH and the latest Doctors Without Border Doctors Without Border staff may have been targeted for being humanitarian workers. Investigations are still ongoing to understand exactly who is responsible for those attacks.
And will USAID publish a report on this, or who's responsible for letting us know the outcome of those investigations?
The partners are working very closely with UN OCHA and other actors on the ground to identify and investigate those attacks.
All right. Well, my time's expired, Mr. Chairman, but I'd appreciate it if you let us know, when Ms. Charles, when you have good information on that. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Ronnie Jackson of Texas. I think we fixed his technical difficulties, who's the vice ranking member for the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Sir, I've traveled to Ethiopia multiple times during my time at the White House. I've enjoyed my visit to the country. I'm saddened to hear about all the atrocities and the suffering that's happening there now. As a medical doctor, and you mentioned this just briefly, I'm particularly troubled to hear of the death of the 3 Doctors Without Borders employees last week and the deteriorating medical situation in general. Mr. Godek, I would like to focus my first question on the conditions in Tigray, particularly the medical realm. Does the administration have a clear assessment of the current impact that the fighting has had on the civilian infrastructure there, and specifically the medical infrastructure? And what is the medical situation on the ground for the civilians there?
Congressman, I think the Assistant Administrator, Charles, well positioned to respond.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for that question, Congressman Jackson. All but 16% of Tigray's pre-conflict infrastructure, health infrastructure, is currently operational, which is why the health response has been a big part of USAID's support to Tigray. We're currently supporting partners to support up to 300 mobile clinics that are focused both on primary health as well as supplemental nutrition, targeting children and women in particular.
Thank you. I appreciate that. My next question is about the relationship between Ethiopia and China. I'm concerned that Beijing seeks to exert control and influence in regions across the world, particularly through their vaccine diplomacy and their Belt and Road Initiative. I believe a primary role of the United States should be to monitor and combat this Chinese malign influence. For either one of the witnesses, what is the role of Ethiopia's external debt to China playing in their bilateral relations? Is China seeking to leverage that debt or become more financially involved in Ethiopian domestic affairs?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. So China does have an extensive economic and commercial relationship and engagement with Ethiopia. They have significant commercial investments, manufacturing and other areas, economic zones, for example. They have built considerable infrastructure and made a wide range of offers to the government of Ethiopia. They do have substantial debt. The Ethiopians do have substantial debt to China, perhaps estimated maybe $14 billion, which is significant. There are debt negotiations ongoing, and those debt negotiations have not been resolved largely because China so far has not been prepared to move forward, and that has delayed any action at the IMF in terms of additional programming that the IMF might do if it chose to do so, although obviously the current situation in Tigray from the administration's perspective would make that problematic. China has sought to has really not engaged particularly on the question of the atrocities and the conflict in Tigray. As I indicated earlier, for example, they have not been supportive of UN Security Council discussions in an open session. They are concerned, I think, about the stability of the region, but at the same time, they believe the conflict in Tigray, for example, is an internal matter for the Ethiopian government.
Okay, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Is there anything that we can do to balance that, or I guess we're doing everything we can, but
Congressman, we are engaged with the government of China. We are also engaged with, obviously, the Ethiopians and a wide range of others. You know, clearly, we would prefer that all friends, partners, all those engaged with Ethiopia work together with us to address the crisis in Tigray, and that's what we're urging them to do.
thank you. I appreciate both the witnesses, and I appreciate your time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, who is the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start by quickly saying my heart goes out to everyone at Doctors Without Borders and Save the Children, both of whom had staff in Ethiopia that were brutally murdered in this past week. Mr. Godek, what is the status of the legal determination on atrocity crimes in Ethiopia? When can we expect to see a formal determination on ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. The administration is very strongly believes that human rights abuses, violations, and atrocities have been and are being committed in Tigray. And we've been deeply concerned about that for some time. The use of the specific terms genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity is a legal determination, and we have had an expedited legal and fact-based review underway to make a determination on that. The final decision rests with the Secretary of State. I can't give you a specific timeline. It is his decision to make. Expedited review and is quite far along.
Appreciate that. I have raised that with him and will continue to raise that. So many of my constituents are asking for us to do so. The UN Special Rapporteur made a finding that Somali troops were fighting with the Eritrean military, including in Axum. Have you been able to independently verify these claims?
Congresswoman, we have looked into this question. We are aware that there were some Somali troops that were in Ethiopia, but I can't give you a definitive answer on whether they've been engaged in actual kind of offensive operations. But we are very much looking at that matter.
Mhm. Do we know the reason why Somali troops are in Ethiopia?
I believe that they were being provided some training by the Eritreans as a result of agreements. That appears to be the reason.
Mhm. So their presence in itself is not a proof that they are there to partake in any of Ethiopian military.
I don't have any additional information at the moment on that, but I'm certainly happy to take a look at it and get back to you with anything further that we have.
The world's focus is very understandably on the horrific situation in Tigray, but I'm also hearing increasingly alarming reports from Oromia. Can you tell us what the situation is in Oromia now?
What I can say, Congresswoman, is that there has been an expansion of the conflict in Oromia. For example, we do see some refugees coming down into Kenya, maybe 750 roughly, something like that, and in other regions as well. And I would say this is just generally representative of the fact that there is been growing conflict in a number of areas, as I said in my testimony earlier, my provided testimony. And these are deeply concerning. I mean, they reflect longstanding grievances, border disputes between peoples, just a number of different issues. And this is what is really tearing at the fabric of the country. And it's why it's so critical that there be this inclusive dialogue that involves all of the people of Ethiopia to reach a better path forward, to find a better path forward that really is genuinely a democratic path and protects and respects human rights. That's what we've been urging the Prime Minister and others in Ethiopia, and frankly also addresses specifically the issues in Tigray.
Someone who was born and raised in the Horn, I do hope that there is a pathway forward that's negotiated that creates peace, especially in Ethiopia, because I think most of us who come from that region understand that that is the heart of the region. Has Abiy's decision to designate the TPLF and the OLF as terrorist organizations made negotiating peace more difficult in your assessment?
It's complicated some other matters. For example, we're concerned about the impact on humanitarian access that those designations had. But what I would say is, of course, there have not been negotiations yet. But we do believe, as I said, that some sort of dialogue has got to take place. And we would urge the parties to have that dialogue and, not to focus on these designations, which obviously we have not designated those organizations terrorists.
I know we can talk at length, but my time has expired, so I yield back my time.
That's correct. The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Young Kim of California, who's the vice ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Mix. Ranking Member McCall, who is not here at the moment, but Congressman Smith, good to see you, and thank you for holding this hearing. And I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. The importance of accurate reporting and transparency in conflict zones cannot be overstated in helping protect vulnerable groups from further violence and enabling actors involved in resolving the conflict to make informed decisions. So as we have seen over the past few months, journalists have been harassed, barred from entering Tigray, and even detained for reporting on the conflict. So, question to you, Secretary Godak. What is the State Department doing to push for access and protection for journalists and even civilians, providing necessary documentation of these atrocities?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. So freedom of the media is obviously very important to the United States. It is a fundamental right, and we believe everyone should have freedom of expression, and there should be freedom of media. We appreciated the steps, frankly, towards a freer media, more freedom of expression that Prime Minister Abiy took when he first came into office. Unfortunately, the situation has changed dramatically. There is harassment, imprisonment of journalists and others who appear to simply be expressing their views. We've seen certainly domestic journalists under considerable pressure, but also international journalists. So, for example, New York Times reporter Simon Marks was essentially expelled. The administration has frequently raised this with Prime Minister Abiy, with other senior Ethiopian officials. We have pushed for protection for these journalists. We've pushed for more freedom of the media, and we will continue to do so. It is critically important, as you indicate, that the people of the country have access to accurate, complete reporting, and that's not going to happen in an environment that is controlled and where journalists' voices are suppressed and other voices are suppressed.
Thank you. I would like to talk about the famine and humanitarian issues. So I'd like to address the next question to Ms. Charles. As you know, Administrator Power recently said that over 900,000 people are currently experiencing famine in Ethiopia. We also know that the humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia is not limited to starvation, but also a lack of adequate civilian infrastructure and access to medical care. So what are those biggest impediments to scaling up to the humanitarian response in Ethiopia? I'm going to give you loaded questions all at once so you can answer all at once. So what is the U.S. and our partners doing to overcome these impediments and push the government of Ethiopia to allow for fully unfettered humanitarian access throughout the Tigray region? And further, how much of Tigray is still inaccessible by humanitarian aid, and what regions or specific routes? And can you report on existing blockages to humanitarian aid in recent weeks?
Thank you for those questions. The biggest impediment, no doubt, is the presence of armed actors and the harassment of aid workers, the blockage of assistance. We welcome the unilateral ceasefire announced by the government of Ethiopia yesterday. We're hopeful that this could potentially provide the first necessary step to allow for access, but we immediately need to see the lifting of the communications blackout around Tigray. We also need to see the Amharic regional forces to remove checkpoints from the three main arteries that we need to access in order to access those that are out of reach. Currently, there are more than 1 million people in Tigray that are out of reach of assistance. And so we need all parties to allow for unobstructed access.
Thank you very much. Secretary Godak, I want to turn the attention to GERD, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So I want to ask you, what is the current impact on the ongoing fighting in Tigray to negotiations with Egypt and Sudan as they work on water projects to make up for the water lost from the Nile as Ethiopia feels its GERD? And what is the current status of these negotiations?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Efforts are ongoing by the administration and by others to assist the parties to reach an agreement on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It is a technical solution that's needed. We believe that there are technical ways to address the interests of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. The challenge has been the absence of political will at the leadership level. We have been engaged directly with the African Union, which is leading the effort. We've been engaged with the UAE, which has been providing some very useful support and assistance for the negotiations, and we're going to continue to press for a resolution of the dispute over the dam. And as I indicated, we believe it is possible to reach a technical solution that satisfies the needs of all the parties.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Tom Melanowski of New Jersey, who is the Vice Chair of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador. And actually, I want to start by saying thank you to you, Ambassador Feltman, to the whole State Department team. I think we have seen an intensive full-court diplomatic press here. As difficult as the situation remains, I think that needs to be recognized. And I think it's a reminder of just how essential and, yes, indispensable American diplomatic leadership is in these difficult situations. There's no other country that can mobilize a global response of the sort that you are trying to mobilize. And by the way, I think it's also a reminder of the importance of some institutions that are often disparaged in this body, including those UN institutions like the World Food Program and UNICEF. Where would we be without them? We're pressing for humanitarian access. Everyone on both sides is pressing for access. That's what we mean. We have these agencies that are willing and able to do incredibly difficult work in dangerous situations where we would not want the United States government or military operating. And so I hope we remember that next time we question our funding to those institutions. I want to ask you about some of the sanctions and visa restrictions that you all have put into place. You told us about some of them. There are restrictions on economic and security assistance to the Ethiopian government, wholly appropriate. And I think it's pretty clear based on what we have heard that we've gotten the Ethiopian government's attention, at least with these measures. But I'm a little bit concerned that they have not been followed by some of our key partners, including our key European partners. And I wanted to ask you to comment on that. Why is that? What objections do they have? Would you agree, is it the position of the administration that it would be very helpful for them to follow suit?
Thank you very much, Congressman, and thank you for your remarks about the State Department and the UN and other agencies, which are indeed doing good and important work at this moment in Ethiopia and elsewhere. We have been very closely engaged with our like-minded partners, the European partners, on the situation in Tigray. And I think it's safe to say that they share our assessment of the risks of what's unfolding in Ethiopia, the threat that the Tigray conflict poses to the region, the reality that the other conflicts across Ethiopia pose a danger to the country's stability and national unity. At the same time, they have not always seen or had the same view on how we ought to proceed, when sanctions should be imposed. We've regularly discussed this question with them. I think many of them were looking to wait until after the June 21st elections to take stronger action. We will obviously see now in the first instance what happens as a result of this interim ceasefire and whether there's actual progress out of that. But if there's not, I would hope and I would certainly urge and encourage them to, as we have, take additional steps to put increased pressure on the government of Ethiopia.
Thank you. Speaking of allies and partners, there were some reports earlier on that UAE drones were armed drones were being used that were based in Eritrea. Do you have any evidence of that? And just more generally, can you talk about any efforts we've made to enlist the Emirates, which have been so invested in Ethiopia, as a more helpful partner?
We have been engaged with the Emiratis and frankly with other Gulf states since the very early days of the conflict in Tigray. Special Envoy Feltman, in fact, was just back there again for discussions. We do know that Emirati officials have engaged with the Prime Minister and with others in the Ethiopian government to urge that they find another road in Tigray, that they end the conflict and allow humanitarian access. So we have been very closely engaged with them on this.
Just a final, more kind of general comment or question. When I used to go and engage with the former TPLF-dominated government, their argument was you need a strong authoritarian hand to keep a multi-ethnic country like this from falling apart, and they're probably saying, now we were right. The counter-argument was always that dictatorship freezes conflict, it doesn't resolve it, and that it was more the bad decisions made by Prime Minister Abiy and how he opened the country and then punished his adversaries in Tigray that are responsible. Any thoughts on that never-ending debate?
Congressman, I would say that democracy is always the best solution. Allowing people to openly address grievances and concerns and find peaceful ways to resolve them in some fashion is always a better solution than dictatorship.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Andy Kim of New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the two of you for coming around. I have to say, it just, as difficult as these challenges are, it's great to see such incredible professionals and public servants like the two of you and the many others that work with you on this. Ms. Charles, I'm going to start with you. You've on a number of occasions talked about this famine being man-made, and I wanted to just kind of have you lift up again some of these actions that are intentionally depriving millions of people of the food that they need.
Thank you for that. Yes, as I said, I think we're facing the first widespread famine in Ethiopia since 1983, 1984, and it's entirely man-made. This is because fighting obstructed harvest back in the fall, and then because you've had obstruction of humanitarian access since then, more than 1 million people out of reach of humanitarian assistance because of the actions of actors on the ground. Even in the last few months, reports of armed actors preventing people from planting, threatening people with planting.
And they're actually going after some of the food sources, is that correct? And storage facilities, is that
And going after looting food sources, storage facilities, wells, and irrigation structures.
You know, over the course of my career, I've certainly seen a number of circumstances that have risen to famine, but this one seems different, you know, in part because of some of what you described there. And Secretary Godek, I mean, I wanted to kind of ask you about this because what it seems like to me is it's about this kind of weaponization of hunger. You know, it's this weaponizing of this to try to achieve your purposes. And in some ways, I'll be honest, famine doesn't seem to quite rise to the occasion to describe something like this. You know, famine feels like something that we, you know, people in my district much more understand that about natural disasters. So, Mr. Godek, I wanted to ask you, is there a better word to describe what's going on? Does our English language have something more specific that can get at this intentional deprivation that millions are facing?
Congressman, I would certainly agree with you that deliberately starving people to death is an atrocity. It is horrifying. And I don't know that there is another word, perhaps, but it is not acceptable. It is completely outrageous and unacceptable to use food to, help you in a conflict. That it is absolutely unacceptable.
Thank you for that. Ms. Charles, anything from your end? Any other words that we should be trying to use to describe this?
I don't know that I have a better word, but I take the point that famine can seem quite clinical, technical, and something that happens as opposed to something that's done to people. And I think we've seen time and time again, and we're seeing in Ethiopia right now, that famine often is not the result of natural causes, but instead the result of men.
It's tough to come across these situations of such gravity that it feels like we're at a loss of words, that we're struggling to actually describe this. And what I just put out to you is that the two of you are amongst the greatest experts we have in our country on these. But let's try to make sure that how do we talk and communicate to the American people about what's going on and try to make sure that we're talking about this in a way that they can really truly understand the gravity of what we're dealing with. You know, I try to think through whether that, you know, forced deprivation or starvation crimes or intentional starvation. I'm still struggling with it too, but it's something I'd like to work with you on. And when you talk about it as something man-made, Ms. Charles, I guess a question for you is, I'm trying to get a sense of how inevitable is a mass catastrophe beyond what we've seen so far. If this is man-made, if we were able to stop the fighting, open up the access, is this something that we can still get under control? Or is this now gotten to a level where it will create at least a year or two or more of severe challenges that we'll face going forward?
We believe that famine is already likely occurring in Tigray, but that's not to say that there's not time to avert the worst. And with the unilateral declaration of a ceasefire by the government of Ethiopia yesterday, I think we have a critical moment for all of the parties to demonstrate that they're serious about averting the worst, because the difference really is the difference between tens of thousands and millions of people facing death.
And I can't see how much time I have, but just one last thing. You know, your numbers are quite different than the IPC numbers in terms of levels. What accounts for that, and how can we make sure that the rest of the world sees it as grave of a situation as you do?
We're sharing our numbers widely. We have a great deal of confidence. We think between 700 and 9,000 people are facing catastrophic levels of food insecurity. We've been working with the IPC process, pressing the IPC process to be open and transparent, but the fact of the matter is that that process can sometimes be susceptible to political manipulation.
Great, thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Sarah Jacobs of California, who's the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Godek and Ms. Charles, thank you so much for appearing before our committee today on this heart-wrenching crisis. Like many of my colleagues, I'm hearing from my constituents every day about their fears for their loved ones in Ethiopia. And while I at first think many of us were cautiously hopeful declaration of a very unilateral ceasefire, I'm now concerned that this
You're breaking up, Ms. Jacobs.
temporary ceasefire, we're seeing reporting that the TDF and TPLF. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Go ahead. I hear you now.
Okay. We're seeing reporting that the TDF and TPLF forces intend to continue fighting. I just want to know what your assessment of these reports are and what it means for our approach moving forward.
Thank you, Congresswoman. You know, we would urge again that all the parties to this conflict engage in a cessation of hostilities, that they cease fighting, that they take this moment when the Ethiopian government has announced a temporary interim ceasefire to do exactly that, to stop the fighting. And we are engaged with all of the parties to this conflict, and that's what we're going to be urging them to do. They need to move into a period of dialogue where the issues between them can be resolved, where humanitarian organizations can have full access to help the people. As we've been hearing throughout this hearing, of course, the humanitarian situation is catastrophic, and we need access, and the only way to get that is to restore security and to get a ceasefire in place. That's certainly the best way to do it.
Thank you. And, you know, Ethiopia has long served as a key anchor for the Horn of Africa and has broad implications for stability in the region. Between what we're seeing in Ethiopia, the Gerd dispute and flare-ups in Al-Fashaga on the Sudan border, our response right now is understandably reactive. So, Mr. Godek, in addition to having the special envoy for the Horn, who I think is doing a good job, what is the U.S. doing to be more proactive in the region to prevent second and third order effects from turning into conflicts elsewhere?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So yes, Special Envoy Feltman is deeply engaged. I just want to emphasize that many other administration officials are engaged. The USAID administrator just held an important session recently to help mobilize response to challenges in the region. Our ambassador at the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield's been deeply engaged. Secretary Blinken's been involved. President Biden's been engaged. So there are many administration officials that have been doing this. And I can assure you that we are looking across all of these crises throughout the Horn and seeking to coordinate not just, of course, our own response, but working with like-minded partners, whether it's the Europeans, the regional partners in East Africa, the African Union. we're working with all of them to address all of these crises. We do see linkages between these problems, and we're really, again, looking to ensure the stability and prosperity of the region and to address these crises.
Thank you. And, in addition to Tigray, I'm concerned about the Benishangul-Gumuz region, which is home to several ethnic groups that are often targeted by ethnic-based violence. We've seen violence from December to April displace over 100,000 in the region. It's also the home to the GERD and everything that goes along with that. And we saw in December, the Amhara regional forces threatened to begin a second chapter of the war in Tigray in Benishangul. And there have been consistent levels of violence since then. So what is state and USA doing to address ethnic violence beyond Tigray? And what are indicators for escalated violence and plans to respond to them and prevent a further deterioration of the situation?
Congresswoman, we are deeply concerned about the conflict elsewhere beyond Tigray in Ethiopia. We have engaged diplomatically. Certainly, we've spoken to the Prime Minister about it, many other Ethiopian government officials. We are urging an inclusive dialogue to help Ethiopia address these challenges. We have offered some suggestions and ideas on what that might look like to assist. In addition, we have a range of programs run through USAID and other U.S. government agencies that are intended to really help build bridges, help bring people together, address the festering grievances that are out there, the long running border disputes and other challenges that are out there. So we've got a range of activities underway in an effort to address the problem.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize Representative Juan Vargas of California, who is the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere, Civilian Security, Migration, and International Economic Policy for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And once again, I do appreciate you bringing up these issues that are so important. And I thank your leadership for that. I also want to thank the witnesses today. A number of the questions that I have been asked, but I want to ask them a little bit more to give you more time. I do have great concern about famine. I agree with Mr. Kim that I wish we had another word and not such a technical word, because the reality is what's happening there is starvation because of the conflict, and we have to do more. Now, I have to say also, I agree very much with Mr. Malinowski. We have great faith in not only our own country, but also in the World Food Program. An American runs that program now, David Beasley. I think he has heroic leadership. I think that they earned the Nobel Peace Prize because of the work that they're doing. And if they give them a chance, they can do something here also to save so many lives. Now, the access has been the issue. How have things changed now, not only because of the ceasefire, but because of also the military reality that just happened this last week? I mean, it almost seems like you'd be able to get more access potentially than less. I don't know. When I first heard about it, I thought maybe there was an opportunity here.
Thank you for that, Congressman. The World Food Program is a critical partner of ours, and as much as we talk about the places and the people that tragically we can't access, we are reaching more than 3.5 million people with emergency food assistance, working with partners like the World Food Program, like Catholic Relief Services and others to reach those that are in need. It's still very early days. The situation on the ground is fluid. We do welcome, though, the moves by the government of Ethiopia in order to unilaterally cease fire, and are hopeful that this may create the opportunity for more sustained access to those that have historically been out of reach to us. But that does require immediate moves by all parties on the ground in order to make that access available.
Now, you spoke of the issue of communication blackout, how that needs to be lifted. Could you explain a little bit more what you mean by that? Has it all been blocked? I mean, even humanitarian efforts?
Yes, we've long been asking the government of Ethiopia to allow for the importation of satellite phones that are necessary in order for our partners to move around Tigray. But over the last week, and certainly within the last few days, we've seen a more comprehensive communications blackout. So no internet, no mobile phones, very limited communication in Tigray, and we would ask for the lifting of that communications blackout again to take advantage of this unilateral ceasefire.
Now, I would ask this, why would they be so determined now? Was it because of the change in military reality on the ground, or why did they make it so absolute?
You know, I can't speak to the motivations of the government of Ethiopia. I don't know if
Maybe the
there's
Secretary, Secretary Godek, could you speak to that?
We've certainly seen the government of Ethiopia across time in the conflict in Tigray greatly limit or completely cut off all communication into the region. It has posed a significant challenge. I can't speak to their motivations. I can tell you we've repeatedly urged from the very beginning that they open up communication to allow humanitarian access and information basically to flow so we can understand what's happening there.
Again, I want to say that I think we all Americans appreciate the work that you're doing there. I do think that the institutions that are there now, as you said, 3.5 million people are being fed, but also the reality of having not only UNICEF, but especially the World Food Program, being there and doing all that it can and wanting to do more, even though they're at risk. It really speaks well for that organization and for the United States. I hope that we do everything that we can to help them. I think that they want to save people there. I really don't understand the notion that you'd starve people to death, especially children, non-combatants. And so again, I thank you for all your work. And I think one of the things you'll find is that we all have great confidence in the World Food Program because of the leadership there. David Beasley is someone that we have great respect for. We know him well. And again, I hope you can continue to work well with him because I think that the World Food Program can make a huge difference in this area right now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. And I think now all member questions have concluded. And I would like to close simply by first thanking our witnesses for your testimony today, taking your time in answering the questions, being very informative in those answers. It will help the members of this committee tremendously. And clearly the situation in Ethiopia is dire, but it's not insurmountable. This conflict, as we all know, has roots in a complicated history that started decades before the violence in Tigray, which erupted in November. But still, it is important for us in the United States to make our position clear. We will continue to press for accountability for all parties involved in human rights violations. That's something that we've got to be focused on, our values. We have taken the first step through visa restrictions and economic sanctions. And I understand we may be considering even further action. And as we enter this new phase of the conflict, I got to tell you, I am very concerned that an escalation of violence may create even more chaos and harm, even hurting and harming more innocent civilians. These fresh reports of potential for a cross-border conflict, I believe, require special attention in the immediate future, in the next coming days. And any move by the TPLF or other armed groups to further stoke the flames during this ceasefire will be strongly condemned by the United States of America and our allies in the international community. So, again, I can only hope that the ceasefire holds, which you have articulated here excellently, and that all parties make a good faith effort to settle this conflict. So let me be clear. That's what I'm trying to do here so that there's no confusion, as I hear from all parties, that the Ethiopian government, now that the Ethiopian government has called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, it is indeed time to push for the full withdrawal of Ethiopian troops from Eritrean troops, from Ethiopia, unfettered access for humanitarian and medical workers, and negotiations where all parties to the conflict participate in good faith. This is the only pathway to peace. So if we have an opening, we should work together to find that solution. I again commend the administration for its work in this regard, further underscoring the U.S. commitment to Ethiopia's people. And let me say also that this committee, and the reason why I thought that it would be important for us to have a full committee hearing on this matter, is that we're not going to be asleep on what's taking place. We've had tragedies. I know when I first came into office, there was no real conversation in Congress about Rwanda. That's not going to take place in this Congress, in this committee under my watch. We're going to stay focused on this. We're going to speak out about it. We're going to work with the administration to do something about it. We're not going to allow people, innocent women, children, men, civilians, just trying to live a decent life, starved. That should not happen on this planet or on that continent ever again. And we could never be silent on that. For example, the words, I close on this, the words of Dr. King always rings in my ears. We won't remember the people who are out to do bad, but we will remember our friends who were silent. We won't be silent. We're going to stand up for our values and for the sake of human life. So I want to thank all of the members. We had great participation by all of the members of this committee today. I want to thank Ranking Member McCall. He's been a true partner in this. This has not been, and this is not a Democratic or Republican issue. It is an issue for all of us. And we've got to let the American people know what's taking place so that we can stand together to prevent this tragedy that is continuing in the country of Ethiopia. And with that, this hearing is now adjourned.
amalli kee kumaatama akkamsi godhu jijjiiramtuu harka keen fuudhu harki keetu danuu qaba siin dhihee bareedaba hadeebi'u gaafiin daba har'a boruun bultii baafata feeta haadhamma mutata osoon dhugin soba machoofta badde gowweetiyya gowwoolee sirraa isi foofoolee soban fedhu dhugaan gala galatu sabaa fala. Didimmisee bokkaarroo buufkaanaan dubbiin itti fidde si gorfachuuf karaan keeruma baata afaan dina faafata dararamnee jireenya bara dheeraa kunoo har'a argine lafa barii simbirwacha hammeessee kanaaf falma jabeesse na laaffisuuf alanshite gamuu kee beekee jira garaanii gama nyaaphaa gortee tadiftee tumtuu garaan tasamman kooftuu laat naan dubbadhaa sodaata kan qabu saba koo falmee lubbuuti yasab hubadhu ati na miidhuuf mala maltus dubbee dhugaan saba koo humaa hunda qabdi laalaal deemsa jaarraa tokko falakkaa keessaa dhugaa dukkanni nyaanne gam qabu warree gamitti baafne dhalootarraan kan jenne yaa jallanni ilaalcha keetii safuun qabne of keessaa gochi kan kee buleetu gubee nama madeessa yoo wal jalaa jajalli ni hammaates dhugaa dukkanni nyaatu Ngoota kumaatamaatu tuffareegee kosaanu ragamatu. Yagantu lubbuu qaaliin taphachaa namarii ofiin jecha. Ya jallatoo riqicha daandii gadhee figantuu. Digamuun kee hin haftu.